Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, our sponsor, Wondrium, Wondrium.com, former Great Courses teaching company, now expanding their horizons to have lots of other content. And it's now a subscription service. So you subscribe, you pay a monthly fee, just like Netflix, Hulu, all the others, and you get access to all their courses and lectures, dozens, hundreds of courses, thousands of lectures. And if you do that through the show here, at wondrium.com/Shermer, you get a 1-month free trial. So, for example, let's just browse the app just for fun to see what pops up. I popped in science. That's our thing here, right? Science. So we got the human cosmos, everything and nothing. I've watched that. That's a 2-part documentary series. Understanding the brain, Earth's changing climate project, or iceberg project, the complete metropolis, examining the big questions of time. All right, let's see what that is. We'll click on that. You just touch on the app, as you know. And this is 12 lectures that are each about 30 minutes long. So, like number 1 is A Matter of Time, The Myth and the Beginning of Time, That Mysterious Flow, Is Time an Illusion, Atomic Clocks, Atoms of Space and Time, Could Time End, the final lecture. Ooh. So I'm going to queue this one up this week and watch that, or more in my case, listen to it. And so should you. So if you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/Shermer, SHERMER, you get a 1-month free trial. What's to lose? I can almost guarantee you'll keep it because it's great free content. And who doesn't multitask, driving, hiking, cycling, doing chores, gardening, weeding, vacuuming, whatever, with your earbuds in, listening to a course, listening to lectures. It's a fabulous way to use your time. So give it a try, wondrium.com/Shermer. Here's our guest. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Jason Hill. His new book is What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. Jason is professor of philosophy and honors distinguished faculty at DePaul University in Chicago. He is the author of 5 books, including We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People. He specializes in ethics, politics, foreign policy, and moral psychology. As you might guess, his answer to the question, what do white Americans owe black people, is nothing. But of course, most arguments in favor of reparations don't think white people should pay. They think the government should pay, that it's the government-sanctioned racist discriminatory policies over the last 2.5 centuries that is part of the problem, that has created the problem, not just white people. And even if no whites today are racist any longer, which is not true, of course, but it's far better than it's ever been, that's not the point. It's the systemic racism. And what that means. So then we bore into what that means, the details of that, and what the problem is to be solved. That is, namely, group differences, black-white differences in income, housing, home ownership, wealth accumulation, generational wealth, and so on. So Jason gives us his thoughts on what he thinks the real cause of that is. He doesn't think it's racism or even systemic racism, but other cultural differences that may themselves have a grounding in what the state has done over the centuries. So that argument, I think, can go back and forth. Then I go through with him. I'm kind of taking a steel manning argument, making the case for reparations, and then he, counters those so you can hear those arguments. What about the Native Americans and all the land grabs that we made there and the genocides, and Germany pays Jews and Israel for the Holocaust crimes in the Holocaust. Shouldn't we be doing the same kind of thing? There is a taking there. There was theft, and so on. Anyway, so we go through all that and then finish up talking about the founding of America and how is it that these great thinkers who wrote one of the greatest documents of all time on liberation and liberty and freedom and autonomy owned slaves. So how do you think about that? So he has a really good answer to that question. And so I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you do, please support us at skeptic.com/donate. Podcast is sponsored by the Skeptic Society. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. And so your donations are tax deductible, and that's what keeps us going, not just the podcast, but also the magazine and all our work. So thank you for listening and enjoy this conversation with Jason Hill. How you been?
I've been well. I've been, writing this book and working on another book, and I'm on sabbatical this semester, writing two more books. So,
Oh my gosh. Wow.
yeah, I've been very busy.
Well, you can tell us about those at the end when I always ask the guests, what are they working on next? This, however, what do white Americans owe black people? Oh man, you have stepped into it. Wow. What a huge topic. I've been reading a lot about this, and you are a brave man, sir. But before we get into that, for those of my guests who didn't hear our previous conversation and don't know about your work, give us a brief biography. You have a super interesting background in biography.
Right. Well, I was born and raised in Jamaica and came to America at the age of 20 in 1985 and moved to Atlanta, where I did two degrees, one in philosophy and one in literature and English literature, and then went on to do my PhD at Purdue University, and subsequently went on to become a professor at first Southern Illinois, and then Cornell, and then I've been at DePaul University for 21 years, where I'm an honors distinguished faculty and professor of philosophy, and this is my fifth book. I've written 4 previous books, the last of which was called We Have Overcome, an Immigrant's Letter to the American People, which was sort of like an homage to American exceptionalism. And I love Letter to the American People, which we talked about on your show. So I've had an extraordinary love affair with this country and with the American people, and I've seen quite a bit of the other side. I've been to about 50 countries, and this country still remains my favorite country. So I wanted to write a follow-up book, in some sense, to the last book, to sort of address some of the divisions and what I call the ideopathogens that are affecting and infecting our country in this new book.
You mean the idea of reparations? So let's get into that. I was thinking, I should point out to my listeners who are listening, which is about 2/3 of the people and not watching, that it's a black guy who is writing a book against reparations. But even that statement kind of goes against the premise of your book, that that this kind of racial essentialism, and even here I am classifying you as a black guy, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of your thesis, that we should stop looking at each other in these racial categories.
Well, I think, and I'm a person of mixed ancestry, but I still classify myself as black, and I have no problem with that. But I think that in some sense we will always, given the criteria that America uses, the one-drop rule for classifying people, and given just the morphological characteristics that we use to distinguish among people, that in some sense we'll always point to differences. But the main point for me is what Freud would call the narcissism of minor differences, just those mere morphological differences or skin attributes or pigmentation. How much significance do we imbue them with? I'm more a value-oriented person, or a radical individualist who thinks that we should appraise people based on the values and the principles that suffuse their characters, and the racial attributes or their racial ascriptive identities that people have really tell us nothing about their moral characters or the values that they hold. And especially in America, where we are sort of a melting pot of different ethnic and racial people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds come here. We're not a country that anymore bases citizenship on lineage or blood or ethnicity. It's based on a set of thin allegiances that we pledge to the republic, political allegiance that we pledge to the republic. So in some sense, I don't think that we can ever completely get away from race, but we can get towards society in which race is not imbued with the kind of almost metaphysical significance that we hold it, the spirit of seriousness that we hold it in an almost reverential manner.
Right. So it's not incorrect for me to say I'm looking at a black guy, or you say I identify as a black man, and I say, well, I identify as a white man. So the idea that I don't see race is kind of naive. Of course, we all see race, but it's that it's not important, or it's probably the least important thing about you, or the least interesting. What I really should care about are your values, your character, what you believe, your beliefs in politics, economics, ideology, religion, whatever. That's when I need to find out about you, not how much melanin you have in your skin, even though I can see that.
That's right. And it only becomes important. In one sense, I think, Michael, we have to see race, because if we don't see race, then we can't. And we have to see gender and sex, because if we don't see those things, then we won't be able to spot real, authentic discrimination. So in some sense, when people say, I don't see race, I want to say sometimes, well, you have to see it, because if you don't see it, then when real racism occurs, or when real sexism occurs, then you won't be able to spot it. The fact is, when we overdetermine race, when we sort of make identity politics predicated on race supersede everything else, and we get into a kind of racial essentialism, where race trumps everything, and we begin to attribute all sorts of causes and disparities and inequities that exist among different groups and attribute them to race, then I think we get into serious problems, because there are all sorts of other causal factors that might be responsible for differences among different ethnic or racial groups that have nothing to do with, let's say, racial discrimination. So that's, I think, where sometimes race does become significant, but at times it becomes completely irrelevant. And the temptation is to always attribute everything to race, when sometimes race is not a causal factor in phenomena or problems that we're trying to fight in our society.
So when we look at group differences, say between blacks and whites on income, average annual income, home ownership rates, marriage rates, percentage of Google programmers rate, whatever, the default position now is to go straight to, well, it's because there's a racist culture at Google or in Congress or in the Fortune 500 or in America. And what you're saying is that may be the case. Maybe Google has a racial attitude and they discriminate against black programmers, but maybe not. Maybe it's something else, and that you can't automatically conclude that from a social scientist perspective. You have to look at different factors and baseline rates behind the group differences and so forth.
That's right. And speaking as a professor in the college, in the university, where I can tell you that in terms of programming and PhDs in computer science, America has an abysmal shortage of PhD candidates in computer programming and computer science, really, black or white. We have to be importing mostly people from Asia, from India and China to fulfill those programs. Now, given the fact that there is a shortage even of white computer programmers, and given the fact that there are fewer blacks going into those fields, not, I think, because of systemic racism, but just given the fact that for a host of reasons, there are fewer blacks in philosophy, there are fewer blacks in chemistry, there are fewer blacks in physics, notwithstanding the fact that, again, as someone who's been a professor of 25 years and have seen the enormous efforts that people in the social sciences and the sciences have gone to recruiting minorities in these fields, for a host of factors, minorities just don't go into certain areas for a host of cultural reasons. It's not because of systemic racism. There are a host of other causal factors that we would have to point to. I doubt very much that there are, given the kind of progressivism that is part of the corporate culture today, and certainly part of the academic culture, I doubt that there is I think we've gone beyond that pale of racism where corporations are systemically trying to keep minorities out of leadership positions. Quite the opposite. They're bending over backward in this age of wokeism and cancel culture and all sorts of other egregious phenomena that are infecting our society, that they're going over backwards to ensure that something like equity is achieved in the workplace.
Right. So it's and clearly these are some of the most liberal institutions in the world, universities and tech companies. So it can't be that they're racist. So then you have the base rate differences. There's just fewer applicants that are minorities or women, and therefore that's why there's a disparity in the ratio of, say, programmers or congressmen or whatever, CEOs. And so then the question turns to, well, why? Why are there not more? And then you go back to, early childhood experiences. Or I remember when Sally Ride in the 90s had a program for keeping girls in math and engineering, science, STEM classes in middle school. Because she said that, girls tended to drop out of those kind of programs around 8th grade. And therefore, by the time they get to college, there are just fewer of them that are majoring in those degrees. So by the time you get to applying to NASA for jobs, there just aren't as many women applying. So therefore, the discrepancy can be tracked back to, say, middle school. So now it gets kind of murky because, how do we identify, well, why are girls dropping out in 8th grade? Or why are minority kids not majoring in STEM fields in grammar school, middle school, high school, and so on? And that's harder to identify, right? Because, it gets back to, you mentioned cultural differences, or maybe there's family issues, or maybe there's, neighborhood issues, or I don't know what. And I think a lot of activists would say, well, it's crappy schools, poor, underfunded inner city schools are not nurturing and nourishing those kids to go into these kinds of programs, and you track it all the way back to that.
And that could be true, and also a culture of previous exclusion, and so a culture of that, which could be traced back to racism that no longer exists, but one could say the antecedent factors could be traced back to a culture of exclusion in which, generationally speaking, marginalized people, or people who we would consider previously marginalized, blacks and women, who were kept outside of certain educational domains, and who are certainly encouraged today, that it takes time for this culture of inclusion to catch up with the interests of those individuals. And so, whereas you have white males who might have always been included in that culture of inclusion, and so generationally those habits and that sense of encouragement, or that sense of just feeling entitled, that one is entitled to belong in those domains, is almost like second skin. So it's not, as someone who's worked on the admission committees in philosophy and can see where, certainly in my department, and other departments where there's an active recruitment program to recruit minorities. There are 10,000 philosophers in this country with PhDs, and about 130 of them are black, which includes Caribbeans, Black Americans.
10,000? There's 10,000 philosophers? Wow. I had no idea.
10,000. Yeah, and only 130 of them are black. So it's just that it'll take, I think, and the numbers increase more and more, but it takes time to broaden the cultural sphere of inclusion such that people take interest in these fields that were heretofore closed to minorities. So I think it's just a matter of time before more and more women are interested in stem cell, more and more minorities are interested in philosophy, more and more people who were excluded from those domains find that the culture of inclusion is not just a temporary one, but is a one that is open, that is permanent, that really wants to include them. And so cultural changes and social changes, by definition, or not by definition, but by nature, are slow. They're incremental. You're not just going to open up a field and expect people who are previously excluded to just sort of running into the field. There are a host of other factors that are at play. Do they feel that they're going to be welcome? Well, are there going to be jobs for them? Is there a culture of non-discrimination when they enter fields that are all white, or in the case of philosophy, it's a mostly white discipline? There are a host of phenomena that have to be addressed, but I don't think it's based on something like systemic present systemic racism that we can ostensibly point to and say there is with full forethought of malice, people who are trying to keep blacks outside of, let's say, the discipline of philosophy, or outside the discipline of literature, or outside the hard sciences.
Right. So as I understand it, even if nobody today is racist, and some are, but far fewer than ever before in history, that's not the problem. The problem is the systemic, built into the system. And that's always kind of problematic to me because, well, then what could we do about that, short of reparations? But this gets me to, again, you can see I read your book very carefully and marked it up. So I'm going to read some passages from the book. You're really a powerful writer. But you quote here President Johnson's, and by the way, I should note parenthetically, you have a structure, a heuristic of 3 American foundings, of course, the 1776 founding, but then the Civil War and post-Civil War, a second founding, and then the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So I'm going to read from President Johnson's, because it seems like everything you just said kind of supports what he says. He says, this is in his speech at Howard University, the famous speech, but freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of century by saying, now you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough to just open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This is the next and the most profound battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just human equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. And the task is to give 20 million Negroes the same chance as every other American to learn and grow, to work and share in society, to develop their abilities, physical, mental, and spiritual, and to pursue their individual happiness. To this end, equal opportunity is essential, but it's not enough. That's a pretty powerful statement, and you have that in there. Why? How do you think about that?
Well, I use that as a way of showing that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was not just an act to bring full equality before the law for blacks, but it was what I call a moral eugenics program, which was meant to sort of reshape the sensibilities of whites, to change the DNA of this country, to make white people into non-racists, and to say that, to follow President Johnson's example, that you cannot any longer use your private property as an extension of your living room or as an extension of your home. You cannot just freely use and dispose of your property as you feel fit. That racism is such an egregious evil, and that the state played such a constitutive role in manufacturing racists in white people who probably were not racist. But let's say you owned a hotel in the South in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, and you wanted to rent your hotel on the interstate to a black. The state made it illegal. The state created miscegenation laws. The state was the biggest enemy of blacks. So I included that to show that and I endorsed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, and I endorsed the kind of eugenical moment that it generated, including, as I state in the book, affirmative action programs, which I was in favor of at the time. I think those were reparative moments that were necessary given the horrific role that the state had played. You don't break somebody's kneecap over and over again, generationally, and then heal them without putting them through physical therapy, and then just break the kneecap, it's healed, and then put them at the start of a marathon with people who have been training for millennia or decades or centuries, and say, no, go run, right? So I think affirmative action programs, and what I describe in great detail as eugenical moment of the 64 Civil Rights Act, was an implementation of what Lyndon Johnson wanted to do. But I think subsequently, the latter part of the civil rights movement went a little bit too far in lapsing into a kind of cultural identity politics, So I do think that in some sense, Johnson was right that we needed to go a little bit farther in terms of extending the kind of help in correcting the wrongs that were part of American culture, American civilization. This country was born with a terrible birth defect called slavery. But the latter part of the civil rights movement, which lapsed into kind of racial essentialism and black nationalism, was completely different than the dream of Martin Luther King and a kind of segregationism that we find that I dealt with in chapter 4 among black nationalists was not something I think Lyndon Johnson would have endorsed. Quite the opposite. I think what he was talking about was what I call the eugenical moment in making it improper for whites to use their property in a way that continued the racist discriminatory practices against blacks. That is, when you use your company that is part of, let's say, a public utility institution, you can't be free to discriminate because racism is now seen as such an egregious evil and is so eviscerative of the dignity of people that there are people who will read this book and agree with me on many elements and then come to disagree with me on this element. And I think there's room for disagreement, that they'll see the 1964 Civil Rights Act as the most egregious violation of property rights. And I'm willing to debate with them, and I understand where they're coming from.
You mean against whites?
Yes, against the use of the right to dispose of your property as you feel. Because property
because the government has to tax everybody to fund these programs, and therefore white people are getting taxed, and therefore that's an assault on their property. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, and also, no, but not just that, just the whole freedom of association that goes with private property. That is, if I own a restaurant and I don't want to, these are people who are opposed to the 64 Civil Rights Act. The argument is going to be something like on the order of, if I own a restaurant and it is my property and I own it through no government help, through my own savings, I open a restaurant, and I don't want to deal with Jews, or I don't want to deal with blacks, or I don't want to deal with gay people. The argument they're going to offer is that no one has an automatic right to my labor, to the tangible results of my labor and my efforts. Anyone who claims that they have a right to the results of my labor is parasitic on my efforts. And so just the mere exercise of my labor and the tangible manifestation of it in the form of, let's say, a restaurant or a business is improper. It's a violation of my property right. The rejoinder to that is that the state has played such an egregious role in manufacturing a racist culture. And in the past, the state has used appropriated black taxpayers' money to endorse an affirmative action program for white people, going back to the gold rush, going back to the railroad industries in California. Even in segregation itself, just in terms of government contracts and patents and all kinds of subsidies granted to companies at the expense of black people, because these are subsidies and these are funds that are allocated not just through the taxes of whites, but through the taxes of blacks, amusement parks, also libraries, everything that you can think of. That in order to really level the playing field, we've got to say that just like the First Amendment is not an absolute, you can't commit libel, you cannot commit slander, and you cannot commit false advertising or shout fire in a theater, that all rights are contextual. And so the point I'm making in the third chapter, I think, is that property rights are also contextual. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I think, and the subsequent acts following it, the 1972 Employment Act, stated on something on the order that, yes, your property rights are yours, but they're contextual. You can't use them in a way that discriminate arbitrarily on the basis of race. And people are going to have a problem with that. And some people see I think I go to great lengths in showing why, given the enormous contributions to racist activities and how the state turned people into racists, the state had a moral obligation to undo this wrong by making property rights contextual in this sort of way.
Right. So if I followed that, the fact that a local store owner in some state wants to discriminate and not serve blacks or Jews in his restaurant. But there's a long history behind that. The state itself was discriminatory that kind of established a culture of this. And therefore, it seems to me that would be an argument for the state to come in and say, you can't do this. We screwed up. We shouldn't have been doing this for centuries. And we did. And that, that was a culture that you've adopted. And so we're not going to let you do this anymore. And, it's not like, let's take the cake baker in Colorado that refused to bake the cake for the gay couple. And so that's considered discriminatory because they're born this way. This is not like a political ideology. We're not going to serve Republicans in this restaurant, or we're not going to serve Nazis, because you choose to become a Republican or a Nazi. You don't choose to become gay or black, or you're born Jewish or whatever. So that's why the government has those categories. These are, just part of your core being that you didn't choose. So the state can't discriminate, and then here's the step, and therefore private companies can't do this as well. So that's what the laws are there. But I'm not sure I followed where you stand on that, because it seems like you're making an argument for reparations, that, it's not that white people owe black people anything. It's that the government owes black people because it was the government that set up that discriminatory culture in the first place, both laws and then the norms.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think the government has made reparative gestures. I think the 1776, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence started with the inalienability clause, started the foundations of black freedom. The Civil War was a reparative moment in the sense of trying to carry through on the promise of freedom. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1972 Employment Act and the subsequent affirmative action programs were reparative moments, and to say nothing of the cultural reparations that were made in establishing Black studies programs, which granted complete autonomy to Blacks in the universities. And the inclusion of Blacks in what I would call the sovereign mass was a grand reparative moment that the state made towards Blacks. Therefore, this idea now that is being introduced and is making its way through Congress, and people like Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi, especially Ta-Nehisi Coates, are advocating that white people living today still owe Blacks reparations, I think is more than superfluous. It's nefarious, because as I make clear in the book, or I try to make clear in the book, going back to 1776, the reparative gestures and moments have taken place, and the wrong has been righted. And short of really now stepping on the rights of a free people and going towards a bloated totalitarian state, there isn't anything more that we can demand of whites in terms of making reparations to individual Blacks. And I even go further and claim that to make a deductive causal link between every suffering, every disparity that exists between the races today doesn't exist. One would have to ostensibly show that every disparity, every inequality is deductively causally linked, traceable back to slavery. And I argue in the book, of course, that there are a lot of other causal explanations that we can ostensibly point to, like certain pathologies in the Black community the birth rate prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act was around 22%. Out of lock birth rate was 22%. It's now 74%. And of that 74% of children, African American children born out of marriage, correlatively speaking, I think 70% of that is traceable back to poverty. So we're not talking about Black women or Black individuals having children out of wedlock who have the income level of Beyonce and Jay-Z. We're not talking about millionaires. We're talking about people who are born into single mothers. And there are all sorts of studies that show that these individuals, these children who are born into single mother households, are more likely to commit crimes, are more likely to be on drugs, are more likely to actually commit suicide. A host of maladies that they're likely to suffer from. So it's not white people who are going into these neighborhoods and impregnating Black women, right? This is a pathology. This is a problem of the Black community that I incidentally argue is a result of the welfare program of Lyndon Johnson that emerged in his Great Society or his War on Poverty, which disincentivized fathers from being fathers because it allowed, and this argument has been made before, it established a state as a surrogate husband to Black women who then were incentivized to have more children because they would receive more welfare payments. And this had to be terribly emasculating to Black men, most of whom I thought wanted to be good fathers, who were good fathers before. So this is the latter part of the civil rights movement, where I think Lyndon Johnson initially had good intentions when he made that famous speech at Howard. It went a little bit too far. I think the non-discriminatory clause of the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 72 Employment Act were sufficient and should have stopped there, but sort of turning this country into a welfare state in order to support the past discriminatory afflictions against Blacks was just a little bit too much, because it ended up harming, I think, the Black community by, among other things, crippling their creative age, expropriating their agency, and crippling their capacity for taking care of themselves. For goodness sake, they were taking care of themselves since slavery and during Jim Crow. The literacy rates were higher under Jim Crow than it was post 1968. The crime rates were lower. Communities were more intact. Something happened in the latter part of the civil rights movement that really damaged the Black community. And it's not de rigueur to talk about this, but it's true.
Yeah, interesting. I guess a couple questions come to mind. The percentage of our GDP that goes to social programs is about 20% in America, which is pretty comparable to most Northern European countries. They allocate about 20% of their GDP toward social programs, which include all the things we have here. Why do they not have that same kind of effect that you just described? Is it that they're more homogeneous as a population? Smaller countries, we're just so massive and big, and maybe in Canada, they even have more extensive social programs than we do, and yet they don't seem to have those problems. Well, except although I suppose maybe they do with their native populations, indigenous people, something like that. Yeah. Just to put some numbers on it from your book, this is you writing here, from 1890 to 1900, a Black person was more likely to be born in a nuclear family than a white kid. At the height of segregation in America, 22% of Blacks were married and had children in two-parent households. According to the Statistical Abstract of the United States, in 1963, 72% of Black families were married and living together. By 2017, however, that data was reversed. Only 27% of Black households were married. In comparison, the white population went from 89% married in 1963 down to 51% in 2017, a 39% decrease. So then would you say that white single women are marrying the state also?
Well, not exactly. I mean, to a lesser extent, I just think that with the sexual revolution, brought about a sort of freedom that disincentivized people from marrying for various reasons. It granted a sense of autonomy and sovereignty over people's lives, in which the diminution of marriage as an institution was a concomitant or a result of the sexual revolution, and the more secular society has become. I'm not arguing against either a religious society or against it. I just think one of the fallouts of secularism and one of the fallouts of the sexual revolution was the granting of, paradoxically, more sovereignty and more autonomy over one's life, and with greater economic freedom for women, which is a good thing, and the emancipation of women from economic dependence on men for their sustenance and their livelihood, came about the result of a less reliance on marriage as a way of supporting women's lives. So I think the sexual revolution, coupled with capitalism, which is a good thing, that capitalism has liberated women from economic dependence on men to a large extent by making them independent wage earners, that this phenomenon has arisen. I don't think the analogy holds quite the same for the 74% of Black American children who are born out of wedlock, because if you look at the statistics, it's a little bit more complicated with white women who have children out of wedlock. A significant percentage, and I don't have the percentage with me right now, but a significant percentage of those women are actually more economically dependent than are Black American women. So I think the last one, the statistics I looked at, is that more working class white women are married. There's a higher percentage of working class white women who are married than are working class Black women. So the nuclear family among the working class, especially in rural America, is much higher among the working poor, the white working poor in this country. So I wouldn't put the analogy the same as yeah.
We're talking about, again, just to be clear here, on average differences. We can all think of examples of people that were born and raised as single moms. My wife is one of them in Germany, and her mom worked her ass off and took good care of her, sent her to good schools. And Germany has a slightly different culture. They have, religious school. She went to a Catholic school and got a great education. So when she hears like, well, single momhood is terrible. Well, no, it's not. But on average is the argument, right? That, of course, there's exceptions, but on average, some of these differences may be due to single parenthood. And then the causal vector there would be that it's just harder to raise children on one income. And just you only have so much time, and that two parents, it's just easier, which I can attest to. It just would be, I don't know how I would do it if I was here by myself with my kid. I wouldn't have a podcast. I wouldn't get half the work done I do, but the duties are split and between my wife and I, and for married couples that both work, then two incomes is better than one income. And again, we're not talking about Beyonce level, where they can hire, people to help out. We're talking about just average people. Okay. So then, say the poor mom who has to work 2 or 3 jobs isn't around for the kid. So the kid ends up going to some crappy inner city school that's underfunded. And this gets to this question, well, why aren't they going into STEM classes? Well, they're barely getting an education at all in grammar school. So by the time they get to middle school, the idea of majoring in calculus and going into engineering and so forth is just not even on the table. So that's what you're arguing. It's not systemic racism from the government anymore. It's now this sort of long-term poverty, and that would be systemic, that lower rates of marriage and so forth. That's more cultural than governmental.
That's right. And also the question that needs to be addressed, which I have been talking about this over and over again, is are people responsible for the procreative choices they make, or is society responsible for the procreative choices that people make? Now, when people say that society is responsible for the procreative choices that others make, I say, on what grounds? When one has a child, that child is a good to that individual. But to say that other people's children constitute a social good, by what means? By what metric are you using? The good is something that is judged by one's personal values. Now, if my neighbor has children, she cannot say, or he cannot say that my children constitute a good for you or a social good on society as a whole, because that would presuppose knowledge of my values and what I not only value in life, but it would presuppose, in some sense, a knowledge of the contributions that those children are going to make to society, which I have no knowledge of. They could be mediocrities, they could be social ballasts, they could be they could be wonderful, individuals who are going to suffuse the world with an assemblage of who they are, which is quite amazing. But one thing that's indisputable is that two things that are indisputable is that children are good for their parents, and two is that individuals in this country get to choose a conception of the good for themselves. They don't have other people foist. That's the one thing about liberalism, is that you get to choose a conception of the good for yourself. You don't have others foist a conception of the good on you. So, just as if you want to worship a Christmas tree as some sort of pagan homage to the Christmas tree goddess, that would be your conception of the good. You couldn't foist it on me and say that I'm forced to accept that as a social good. So the deeper philosophic question that I have been asking often is, when we have children, there's no natural right to have children. One does not have a constitutional or inalienable right to have children. You have children that you can afford, just like you don't have a right to buy a car if you can't finance it. And you don't have a right to buy a house if you can't finance it. You have the right to pursue the efforts that will secure the means to purchase a house or a car. So a right is a right to an effort. It's not a right to an object. It's a right to pursue an effort that will get you the object, and that no one has a right to impinge your effort in the pursuit of your happiness or the pursuit of an object, or you don't have a right to a job. Nobody has a right to give you a job. All you have is the right to pursue efforts on your behalf, and that the state has no business, or anyone has any business, placing obstructions in your path. So the question is, this cycle of poverty that is endemic to certain communities, like the Black community, is partially the responsibility of those individuals who choose to have, or choose not to exercise precaution, but choose to have children that they can't afford, by bypassing the question of, am I being fiscally responsible in having children I can't afford? I mean, we have this very lax sentimental ideal that people just breed and procreate, and that society picks up the slack and picks up the cost of their procreative choices. And I'm asking a more difficult question. You don't have the right to have children if you can't afford them. That's a very hard thing pill to swallow, but your procreative choices are yours to bear.
But that kind of assumes that people are educated and rational enough to make a decision, whereas a lot of these pregnancies happen, kind of spontaneously, emotionally, on the whim, not thought out, just whoops. And this is why we have abortion, so that, women aren't getting abortions because they like killing babies. It's that they can't afford it. They don't have the resources to bring another child into the home, especially if they already have, say, 3 or 4 and there's no father present. So, what are they going to do? The paper on this was titled "Hardness of Life, Not Hardness of Heart." And, that gets to the kind of liberal conservative difference on the abortion issue and these larger issues. You're getting at free will, people have autonomy and so on. There's a certain assumption you're making that, we're all equal in our, the education and rationality. And, I understand, what sex leads to. And here I have access to birth control through my healthcare program. And I've been educated and pounded into my head at home by my parents and at school by the sex ed program. Don't do this. And at some point when you get to be an adult, hopefully that's all inculcated. And now you are a rational, autonomous adult making adult decisions. And I think the liberal counter to that is that that's not true culturally, that some cultures and communities don't have that same level of education and parental influence and so on. And therefore, the government needs to do something about that when those bad decisions are made.
Right. Well, I mean, all I want to do is establish the philosophical premise that when we see these disparities occurring, that it's not due to systemic racism. It might be due to personal ignorance. It might be due to a cultural certain cultural flaws within the community. But when anyone tries to say that the cycle of poverty and that you can ostensibly point to X percentage of poor people within a demographic group, that it is due to systemic racism, I simply want to point whether causally that's the result of ignorance or a lack of the exercise of one's free will or some sort of other epistemic causal factor that we can point to, that it certainly is not it's certainly not systemic racism. We can say it's ignorance, we can say it's carelessness, we can say it's lack of responsibility. But I just want to establish the philosophical principle that will refute the claim that it is caused by systemic racism. That is, there's nothing about a woman having, or a man or a woman having 4 or 5 or 7 children that they can't afford, that is causally linked to slavery, that is causally linked to current systemic racism. It's causally linked to other things, but there's a kind of recklessness and a kind of sloppiness and a kind of sentimentality of thought, or absence of thought. It's just mere sentimentality and a kind of emotionalism when people say that, without thinking it through very carefully, that Mary and Jack and whomever who generationally are having more children than they can afford, that we just say, well, and we look at the consequences of this, and it's repeated generationally, that this is systemic racism. When those people are unable to afford an education for their children, or they live in neighborhoods that are, financed by property taxes, that this is not systemic racism. There are people, and we find this happening in Europe, who make conscious choices, and we find this in the middle class in general. The middle class is an interesting phenomenon, that the higher their income rises, is the fewer children they have, because you would think that the more money people make is the more children they have. But this is an interesting phenomenon that you and I both are aware of all the studies, and just empirically, that as people rise in social and economic mobility, they tend to have fewer children because they, for various reasons, they don't want to spend their money on a herd of 5 or 6 children. They want to improve their quality of life and their standard of living. And we know that having more children might improve one's quality of life. There's nothing more than a beautiful child or beautiful children, but it does lower economically your standard of living if you're not making the proportionate amount of income that can sustain an increased family. So we know that there are people who make fiscally responsible choices as their wealth increases. They have fewer children. They're thinking through what it would cost them to have more children. That having more children would paradoxically decrease the wealth that they are consciously striving to increase and are actually increasing.
All right, you have your 3 foundings of America: 1776, 1865, and 1964. Okay, we drilled down a little bit on the 64 one. I want to look at the other 2. But before we do that, I could see somebody like a Kendi or a Nicole Hannah-Jones or something saying, yes, I agree with you. We need one more. We need a 4th American founding. That's the reparations movement now. and then the slate will be clean. Are you arguing that we've had now almost 50 years, well, I guess it is 50 years of affirmative action, and that is reparations. That was the reparations movement. It is done. Now you're free to be equal or so on.
Yes, I am. I'm saying that we've had a bunch of reparative moments, starting with the civil rights movement and the Emancipation Declaration, which was insufficient. And really, that was not reparations. That was simply granting people, their slaves, individuals, their inalienable rights. But if we wanted to be semantically generous, we could call it reparations. The civil rights movement, in which both blacks and whites fought to free slaves, was certainly a reparative moment in the second founding of this country. I call it the second founding because the Civil War, because it really brought into the domain of the ethical and into the pantheon of the human community those who had been excluded from all talks about inalienability and inviolate worth and intrinsic dignity. And so it still wasn't enough because the rights of blacks were still not being respected. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was the third founding because it really, really did establish full equality before the law for blacks, in which punitive laws were no longer established based on race, or laws that were punitive based exclusively on race. My sense is that if we had a fourth founding based on reparations, we would not recognize our constitutional republic as the constitutional republic that we live in. It would be highly punitive. I'm not going to talk about the horrific mechanics of figuring out how we would go about taxing whom to finance whom. That is, how would black people be exempt from the taxation process? Would it be free education for blacks? Would it be some people talk about a lump sum? I've heard talk about, $150,000 for each black person. I mean, the mechanics and the configurations are mind-boggling. I prefer to talk in terms of the fundamental principle of it. There's something highly punitive. So let's talk about what the principles that secure the reparations argument. They have to do with, they fall along two axes. One is the ancestral argument, which I find very, very dangerous. That is, white people today have ancestors who own slaves. Well, the statistics show that most of the white people living today, their ancestors came after the Civil War. But even if you could show that 100% of today's white people, ancestors own slaves, I would actually say, so what? What has that got to do with those living today? The sins of the fathers cannot be passed on to the children. If the inverse of that were to be applied to blacks, look at how horrific it would be. The majority of crimes in this country, homicides, carjackings, and rapes, let's just be honest, are committed by African Americans. Now, if someone were to look at me and say, as a black person, although I was not born in this country, but you still share the same racial ascriptive identity, you bear the shame and the collective guilt or the collective crime of those who share your racial ascriptive identity. It would be horrifying. So ancestral guilt is something that is a form of biological collectivism, which is tyrannical. It has nothing to do with the person living today. And the second thing is that, again, it assumes a sloppiness in thinking. It simply assumes that every disparity, every inequity, every problem, from diabetes to high blood pressure, that afflicts the black community. Nicole Hannah-Jones and others make this case. Obesity is traceable back to the production of sugar and all sorts of contributions that blacks made during slavery to the growth of this economy, that they're causally traceable back to slavery. I think this is the work of a proper social scientist and for scientists to do, and economists. And those causal deductive establishments or chains have not been made. They would have to be made. what we've gotten away with is a kind of sloppiness that rides on the premise that if we can simply show that there are disparities, that there are asymmetries between the races, then it must be because of slavery. It must be because of systemic racism, without doing the painstaking job of showing, yes, in some cases, there are residual effects of slavery. One would be hard-pressed and one would be almost idiotic to say that there can be no residual effects of slavery existing today. The question is, how much, to what extent, and are those sufficient enough to invoke a fourth founding based on something like reparations, which is quite punitive and is going to really exhaust our communities and our country to such an extent. So are the residual effects so large, so systemic, so determinative of the destiny and fate of blacks that we have to resort to something like reparations? And I would say the answer is no. The proof has not, I'm not satisfied that the proof has been established. And I fear that it would divide our country so much. Race relations are hanging in the balance right now. They were improving for a long time. I've lived here for 36 years, and I was just enormously pleased at seeing with each passing year how race relations were improving. And I'm not so positive that they're improving anymore. I think, there are a lot of idea pathogens out there, reparations being one of them.
So the resentment whites might have toward blacks getting, say, a check every month from the government, which clearly the government's capable of doing. They just sent checks out to everybody for COVID twice, two big rounds, almost $2 trillion. And, so the argument isn't that they can't do it. Government could do that. Of course, we need an economist to explain to us how this is not going to lead to massive inflation down the line. $2 trillion on two wars, $2 trillion in COVID relief, $2 trillion more in reparations. I've seen figures as between $1 trillion and $11 trillion is what is owed to Black Americans. And but the question, would that tank the economy? I don't know. It seems like it has to have some effect. But that aside, you're arguing it wouldn't do what it is hoped it would do. So let's say the government doesn't send anybody a check. The government just builds a trust that says, out of this trust, we're going to fund inner city schools. We're going to fund Head Start programs for poor Black children to catch up, and so on. In other words, President Johnson's dream there. We're gonna bring them up to the start line where they really are physically and mentally and educationally and all other ways equal. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, so long as government schools exist, and I'm not an advocate of government schools or public schools to begin with, so long as government schools exist, and taxpayers' money are financing government schools, the government should be doing that. I think it's disgraceful that you can type in somebody's zip code and know the education that they're going to receive, right? So there's nothing in principle wrong with that. Once we have government schools, which it's financed by property tax, which is a horrific occurrence in this country. I mean, it's the government again spearheading. It's an argument for getting rid of government schools because it's discriminatory if you're going to base it on property taxes. But if we have government schools, the government has no business discriminating on the basis of wealth, on the basis of someone's income, which is precisely what they're doing by basing the quality of an education based on the income level that someone earns. So in principle, I would say that if we do have government schools, I don't think they're going away anymore. I personally would love to see the Department of Education shut down, eliminated completely, and we have private schools. And I'd rather see people not taxed on the income that they would use then to send to their children to private schools, or have tax vouchers for education or something like that. But to answer your question, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. That should be the responsibility of the government to give not just blacks, but poor white children, Hispanic children, all children, a proper education that is equal across the board, as they do in Europe. Europe, I know they have vocational schools, but if you matriculate through the lycée in France, right, regardless of your income level, you're given a pretty good rigorous education. So there's nothing wrong with what you're saying in principle. That should be the role of the government, the state, to the extent that we do have government schools, state-funded schools. The state should be doing that. It's ethical responsibility. If it's using tax dollars to finance education, what it's doing, again, an argument for shrinking government and getting rid of government involvement in. People forget that the Department of Education was not started until 1979, and the Founding Fathers didn't say anything, and there was no such thing as universal education in this country until quite recently. People seem to think that somehow constitutionally there was this notion of a universal education or public funded education. I would more, but let's just say that there is public education, and government schools are going to be around for a long time. Everyone should be getting a heads up or a head start or a rigorous, robust education. We certainly had it in segregated schools in blacks and I'm not advocating going back to segregation, but black schools certainly had teachers who were, disseminating a rigorous education to blacks, which is why the literacy rates, Condoleezza Rice has spoken about this, was so high. So we know that that state-funded schools are capable of delivering, a good education to students. And in those neighborhoods that are poor, that it could top it up a little bit more with extra funds in those neighborhoods. I wouldn't call that reparations. I would just call that restorative justice. I would call that just making it fair across the board for everyone and end the discrimination in education that is taking place, which is nefarious and quite horrific.
Yeah. I had Chris Edwards on this show. He's an education reformer who was pointing out the zip code system and also the housing, what drives housing prices up around the good schools, which makes the schools better, which drives the housing prices up. And you get this Matthew effect: to those who have, more shall be given. So the richer you are, the better the schools you go to, and then the opposite effect. The poorer schools get even poorer, and so you end up with this massive divide that has nothing to do with systemic racism or anything like that. It's just how the system is set up. That people making choices for themselves and their own family, their children, obviously want to do that. And so they're going to try to make more money so they can move into the better neighborhoods, so they can send their kids to the better schools, short of just sending your kid to a private school wherever you live. So one of the arguments against that is that, just private schools, say, or school vouchers, is that you're going to get a massive divide between good schools and bad schools, and then people will fall through the cracks, and we can't have that. Everybody's got to be educated. And I'm guessing your response to that would be, they're already falling through the cracks. There's massive numbers of kids who never graduate from high school in these public schools that are purportedly lifting all boats up to have a higher tide of education.
Well, I would go much more beyond that and say that in a free society, in a really free capitalist society, it is in the economic interests of educators to come up with a better mousetrap. There is no way in a free society that broad swaths of people who are poor are going to be left out. Someone who is very smart is going to capitalize on the needs and the desires of those people and provide a way to educate them that is fiscally, financially, or let's just say it's fiscally within their means, either through lowering tuition or through loans at a very, very low interest rate. It just doesn't. We see this happening where cell phones were once, this is a phenomenon of the free market. Cell phones were once the what do you want to call it? the privilege of the rich or the wealthy, and now it's it's in every person's possession. Widescreen TVs, all so-called luxury items, and we could call a private education or a good education initially a luxury item in the free market, where there are no interferences by the government to patent or to create subsidies, to create competitors from entering a field. Eventually, people with a good or better mousetrap will find a way of catering to these broad swaths of poor individuals and provide a good education for them. And we see this with the Catholic schools, right? Whether one is pro-religion or not, the Catholic schools have worked an enormous amount of magic, and I use the word magic because it seems magical, on black kids, where the attrition rate is very, very low, and they graduate with pretty high GPAs, and the literacy rate very, very high. So I would not say that people are going to, not just that they're already falling through the cracks, but that this would be a way to prevent them from falling through the cracks.
Yeah. Another argument I've thought of against reparations is that once you open that door, certainly Native Americans would have a justification for demands. And you can certainly look across the board between whites and Native Americans, home ownership, income, and alcoholism rates, education levels, and so on. Just massive differences. They don't happen to have a strong voice right now, so we don't hear about that. But if anything, the amount of land that the U.S. government confiscated from Native tribes and nations would be probably $100 trillion, whatever the value is. If you own 1 million acres in California and the U.S. government says, thank you very much, we're taking that. What would that land be worth now? I live here in Santa Barbara. This was all Chumash, Native American Indians up here. Well, I can tell you, it's pretty valuable property up here. The land on the coast would be massive. And, they would certainly have a demand on that, it seems to me.
Well, this notion of stolen land and genocide, I have a different view on it, which is quite controversial. I mean, I tend to think that there was no such thing as genocide, and there was no such thing as stolen land. There was a war for resources. The Native Americans came second, and they lost. And if you look at every single civilization, whether we're talking about Philip of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, William the Conqueror, every single civilization was forged in the crucibles of conquership, confiscation. The Native Americans also conquered lands and drove people away. I can't remember the name of the group, slips me right now. I wasn't anticipating this question from you, but there was a war for resources. The 1924 Indigenous Act, which was passed by Coolidge, is not compatible with the idea of genocide. The British and the Americans did have the technological means to wipe out every single Native American. Quite the opposite. There was forced assimilation and forced inclusion, unlike blacks who were subjected to forced exclusion. So I think I tend to see it as, even going back to the Mexican-American War, are we going to give back land to Mexico? No, there was a war and they lost the war. There was a war for resources. And I would even say that I would make the argument that when you lose a war, you become a war refugee on conquered lands. So rather than see the Native Americans, I probably get into a lot of trouble for saying this, but I'm used to getting into trouble. Rather than seeing the Native Americans as living on stolen land, I sometimes see them as refugees living on conquered land, fought in a war for resources. So I'm not buying the stolen land stuff, because if you buy the stolen land narrative, then morally you are required to give it back, no matter what you've done with it. If it's stolen and confiscated, you're under an ethical mandate to give back that stolen land. So I don't think there was any genocide. I don't think there was that is a willful and desire to annihilate, exterminate a people. that was never the intention of the Americans to willfully annihilate the Native Americans. Quite the opposite. The whole smallpox phenomenon was a couple of incidences that happened. Most of the Native Americans died from diseases that were unknowingly passed on by the Europeans and by Americans. So there was no. It's not like Hitler, who had a willful desire to exterminate Jewry and Jews from the face, not just Europe, from the face of the earth. The Americans had no such intentions, and there was a war. There was a war for resources, and the Native Americans lost. They came in second, so they're war refugees living in America, and people can make of that what they want. We don't owe them the return of any of that at all.
Historically, that's true around the world. I mean, the British Empire. They would owe everybody, $100 trillion or whatever it would be for all their colonies. I went out to Twitter on this and asked for people to make comments about this subject of reparations. Here's one. People arrived in North America at least 12,000 years ago. You're telling me that the Blackfeet have been in control of this particular part of northern Montana since the beginning? That they didn't take it from anyone? Who are we supposed to return it to? Yeah, so that's the history of civilization. It's just how it's always gone. It's pretty a new idea that, once the borders are drawn, we're going to enforce that they don't get changed, such that when someone like Putin grabs a piece of Ukraine, Crimea, then, everybody is up in arms about it, but then no one does anything about it because that's kind of the way it was always done. Right. So, yeah, that's the problem with that. And then the Holocaust example, people often bring that up. Nicole Hannah-Jones points out that the U.S. government pays, I didn't know this, if it's true, $5 million a year to Holocaust survivors living in America. And that this is a moral thing to do, and this is the kind of justification for why Black Americans should get reparations if we do this for Jews. I have no idea why that law exists, but certainly in Germany, Germany paying reparations to Jews, victims of the Holocaust, that seems more justified to me because they can identify exactly what was stolen. That was my house right there, and I want it back. Or that was my artwork that the Nazis confiscated. I want it back. Of course, that gets a little dicey when you have like 3 or 4 sellers in between that have been selling that art, and the guy that owns it now bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody, and it doesn't seem fair for the current owner to have to give it away, give it back for free. Anyway, lawyers kind of work on all that stuff. But I guess I trust your argument would be, yeah, but those are current victims. There's been a taking, and they have a right to get their property back. But
That's
we
right.
don't have that now because generationally it's so long ago.
Well, if you had a family in South Carolina or Tuskegee or wherever, and you could ostensibly show through property deeds that land was confiscated by the state, I think in that case the land has to be returned. But that would not be reparations. That would just be a form, again, of what I would call restorative justice. That is, the land was illegally stolen from someone who had a rightful claim of purchase, a deed, a title to it, and it was stolen. That then you would have a proper case for, I guess the loose term would be reparations. But for me, it would just be the rightful restoration, in the same way that the Nazis stole jewelry and artworks and paintings and houses and all sorts of artifacts that belong to Jews. And if you can ostensibly point and say that belonged to me and you have proof of ownership, then it should be returned.
Here's another example that from my responders. It's a little remarked upon fact that on February 23rd, 1861, Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs just as the American Civil War was beginning. Does the Russian government owe the descendants of the serfs, who were essentially slaves, anything in reparations? If Native Americans often defined themselves by culture, for example, the Seminoles were not an ethnic group but the name of a group of escaped slaves, indentured servants, and natives who survived disease, then who gets paid? If we prorated the value of the American Southwest that was taken from Mexico, well, we discussed that already. He says, I sometimes ask my more liberal colleagues when talking about Israel if the Ottoman Empire should give Constantinople back to the Byzantine Empire. I usually get a blank look, the point being that there's no way to undo history.
That's right. That's right. We move forward, and to the extent that we recognize that there were certain injustices that were committed without egregiously violating the rights of individuals today who had nothing to do with those injustices. There are no white people today who are slave owners, and there are no black people today who are slaves. We do our best in terms of a form of restorative justice to right those wrongs. And so I think that this is what we do. We move forward. We try to make opportunities available to those who'd been heretofore marginalized, which is what affirmative action programs have been doing, which is what the 19th Century Employment Act did, and which is what the whole eugenical moment of what I spent an enormous number of pages explaining to our readers. The 1964 Civil Rights was not just bringing blacks full equality before the law. It really was a radical eugenical moment in the history of this country to really try to make non-racists out of white people. And it was an audacious move that I have a complicated relationship to as a person of color, because clearly I benefited from it. At the same time, I understand how a number of white people might be resentful of having the state intrude on their agency. But I do make the point that, again, going back to the way in which the state has been, and to some extent still continues to be, instrumental in fostering a racist climate. I mean, there were hundreds and thousands of whites and blacks who wanted to get married, who just loved each other as people in the States. No, you can't. Average white citizens didn't create miscegenation laws. Average white people didn't create Jim Crowism. It was the state who did, and they inherited slavery, but they kept it. So they created an ethos, and they created sensibilities, and they reinforced them culturally, generationally. So the eugenical moment that I describe, I don't think which anybody else has ever done in terms of describing the 1964 Civil Rights Act to the best of my ability. I think I'm the first person who has ever done that in given myself that kind of interpretational latitude. Is a very complicated affair. And I think our society really is the better for it. It has made us a less racist society. We've gone beyond that pale of racism. So it really was a re-socializing moment where whites were really re-socialized, in the same way that anti-sexual harassment laws have worked magic on men. I mean, I think there's a great assault against masculinity that's taking place in our culture, but there is just ways in which men cannot speak to women and treat women in the workplace today because of, again, the eugenical way that anti-harassment laws work, that I think it's good that, you should be eviscerating women of their dignity by slapping them on the rear end.
Right. That word, eugenical, just so people don't mishear you. You mean the DNA of the culture or the norms, something like that?
Yes. I'm using it in a broader sense.
That word is kind of loaded, as you know.
It's loaded, and I use it deliberately. So I'm not...
Yeah,
go ahead.
You do like to poke the hornet's nest, don't you, Jason? All right, let's go back to then the founding itself, the 1776 founding. I mean, one of the themes of the anti-racism and BLM movement is that, our founders were really racist to the core. I mean, look at these quotes from Jefferson or Lincoln, and Jefferson owned slaves, Washington owns, the whole dialogue on that. I love that you included this quote from Abraham Lincoln, because he was trying to square that circle. How is it that our founders were so great to create all this freedom, and yet they owned slaves? Here you include, Lincoln says, I think the authors of that notable instrument, the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say that all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. They define with tolerable distinctness in what they did consider all men created equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this they meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all men then actually enjoying that equality, or yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit.
That's right.
All right. So explain to us how you square the circle of our great founding fathers who believed in liberty and they owned slaves.
Just exactly as Lincoln explained it, that the foundations were forged in the crucibles of the Declaration and the Constitution. That is, we know that we're not all equal. I'm not the equal of my Jamaican compatriot, Usain Bolt. He has great athletic prowess. I have 5 college degrees, including a PhD, which means I enjoy educational privilege. I'm not going to dumb myself down to sound like the village idiot on his cognitive level. Some of us enjoy beauty privilege. I mean, I'm not the most handsome person in the world. There are people who are much, much better looking than I am, and they have beauty privilege. So this notion of egalitarianism in the metaphysical sense of the term is ridiculous. And some people are much more intelligent than others, and some are cognitively quicker, and some are slower. Some are just dim-witted, and some are nicer people, morally superior. So, but we are equal in the sense that we are deserving, and we are born with certain inalienable rights that are necessary for us to live as rational human beings. The pursuit of freedom is one such right. We need freedom to live and to exercise our nature as rational human beings. The pursuit of happiness is our highest moral purpose. And so the founding fathers recognized that, but recognized the milieu in which they lived at the time was a racist one in many respects. In all respects, practically, it was a milieu in which they had inherited slavery from the British. Had they granted it, slavery was a compromise. The South would never have ratified the Constitution, and America would never have come off the ground, and the Republic would never have been formed. So they made a tragic, but not, one could call it tragic compromise, but laid the foundation in just the quote that you read from Lincoln, that, make no mistake about it, those that are not currently included in talk of inalienability one day will be and should be and must be. And that's why I say the foundations for Black freedom are forged in the crucibles of the founding of this republic. Martin Luther King himself always liked to talk about the promise that was never delivered, but that was forged in our Declaration and in our Constitution. So where we get our moral vocabulary from, when you look at the civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and others, we are the legatees, we're the beneficiaries of certain moral and political vocabularies that are forged in the registers, in the vectors of the Declaration and in the Constitution itself. So that's what we fall upon. We're not like these obstreperous children today, the Generation Z, that want to get rid of the Constitution. We realize that our Constitution provides the foundational principles and values and first premises out of which arise the basis for which we defend our freedom. So they might, yes, a lot of them were racist, but in spite of their racism, in spite of their maybe aesthetic dislike of blacks, or Negroes as they were then called, they were able to rise above their own limitations of the time, the limitations of the time, their own prejudices, and exercise what I think I do an exhaustive job of talking about, their sense of life, their moral imagination. They were able to get outside of themselves and exercise their moral imagination to envision a time that existed beyond their time. They were writing a constitution that would exist not just in the current time configuration in which they were writing, but that would extend in perpetuity. I mean, so this is how I square it. I don't think that if we judge individuals solely on the basis of their current opinions, or solely on the basis of their current whims or desires, we run into great problems if we overlook the larger philosophic system that they devise. So the question is, do we want to really judge the Founding Fathers based on their parochial views about blacks and of the time, or do we want to judge them by a larger philosophic system? And I do think that the Constitution, I mean, I teach the Founding Fathers as part of my survey of political philosophy, that it is a philosophic system, a very rigorous and lasting one. And I do this with all the philosophers. I mean, Aristotle was the greatest philosopher who ever lived, I think, but he also had a defense of of slavery. And it's a defect in his system, but the system itself is so magnificent, and in spite of his limitation there, he provides also resources that we can rescue Aristotle from Aristotle. So I think the Founding Fathers themselves, I would say, provided premises and foundations within the system that we can rescue them from themselves. And I think I go into some detail in describing how Jefferson was anguished and felt such moral shame for owning slaves, couldn't bring himself to free slaves because in one sense he was an aristocrat who was used to a style of living. On the other hand, didn't know what would become of those slaves if he freed them. He feared for their lives, that the time just wasn't ready for whites to accept as equals freed black slaves. So I think the history is very complicated, and I'd like readers to take away that sense of nuance and complication and not just fall into some kind of one-dimensional approach to our Founding Fathers. They were heroes. They were flawed men. They had feet of clay, but they also had immense stature and, above all, moral imagination that took them outside of their parochial viewpoints and into a larger sphere of what they envisioned for humanity, which included blacks.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at today's politicians and some of the goofballs in Congress, you think, where is the Lincoln and Douglases and the Hamiltons and Jeffersons and Adams and gosh.
Adams, yes. Adams did, and by the way, Adams did not own slaves on principle.
Right. No, that. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen that HBO series. I think it's 10 hours or 12 hours of John Adams with all the major players. It's really quite well done. Now, let's finish up talking about the origins of that idea. This kind of founding of America was unique in human history. This has never been done. The system is set in place to be self-correcting. I think of it almost like science. Science is this great method that can correct errors. And so, but when people say, well, then, but they don't, but they get it wrong a lot of the time. So you can't say science is great. No, the fact that they get it wrong and then correct it, that's what makes it great. It's a self-correcting process. So I attribute this in my book, The Moral Arc, much to a scientific way of thinking. Here's what I write. Even the fundamental principles underlying the Declaration of Independence, which is usually thought of as a statement of political philosophy, were in fact grounded in the type of scientific reasoning that Jefferson and Franklin employed in all the other sciences in which they worked. Consider the foundational line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." In his biography of Benjamin Franklin, Walter Isaacson recounts the story of how the term self-evident came to be added to Jefferson's original draft by Franklin on Friday, June 21st, 1776. Here I'm quoting Isaacson. The most important of its edits was small but resounding. He crossed out, using heavy backslashes that he often employed, the last three words of Jefferson's phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," and then changed them to the words now enshrined in history, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The idea of self-evident truths was one that drew less on John Locke, who was Jefferson's favorite philosopher, than on the scientific determinism espoused by Isaac Newton, and on the analytic empiricism of Franklin's close friend David Hume. In what became known as Hume's fork, the great Scottish philosopher, along with Leibniz and others, had developed a theory that distinguished between synthetic truths that describe matters of fact, such as London is bigger than Philadelphia, and analytic truths that are self-evident by virtue of reason and definition. The angles of a triangle equals 180 degrees. By using the word sacred, Jefferson had asserted, intentionally or not, that the principle in question, the equality of men and their endowment by the Creator with inalienable rights, was an assertion of religion. Franklin's edit turned it instead into an assertion of rationality. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that's true. I think that you can actually even take God outside of the equation and just look at objective study of human nature and realize, going back to what I would call Aristotle's law of identity, that A is A, that everything has a particular nature, and that nature has certain requirements for the longevity and the preservation of itself. So if you look at the stomach of a human being versus the stomach of an alligator or a crocodile, there are certain things that, given the nature of a human stomach, it can't ingest that a stomach of a crocodile can. So when we look at human nature, we realize that it's objective. It is not arbitrary. It is not open-ended in biologically speaking. It has a particular nature, and it requires certain material conditions for it to survive. That we do have that reason is our main tool of survival, and that reason is a faculty that needs certain material conditions in order for it to operationalize itself and to manifest the empirical and the tangible conditions that are conducive to man's survival. So the founding fathers were able to perceive correctly, realizing that despotism is inimical to a life of flourishing, because reason needs to operate through trial and error, and reason needs freedom in order to operate through trial and error, and then to make the sort of deductive and inductive inferences in order to come to a conclusion that is correct. That you can't do this under force, that you can't do this without the freedom to experiment in different ways of life, experiments in living. So I think this is quite true, that the mind-body dichotomy that had afflicted philosophers for ages was finally brought to a closure by the founding fathers, who remedied that mind-body dichotomy by seeing, in some sense, that the analytic truths that the debate between synthetic truth and analytic truth were remedied by. And there have been a number of books that have been written about the influence of the Stoics, for example, and the Aristotelian influence on the founding fathers. But I think all of this is true, that the inalienability is a deductive conclusion that is derived from a rational study of man's nature, and also a realization that reality is objective, that there's an objective reality out there that consciousness perceives, that consciousness is not something that exists. Consciousness does not create reality. Consciousness discovers reality, perceives an objective reality. And when we think about the consequences of that there's an objective reality that exists independent of my consciousness, and that my consciousness perceives that reality, then the whole process of perceiving what are the correct requirements for my nature as a rational person to exist becomes a venturesome task. And that's what the founding fathers were able to bring politically into the world. It was an epistemological feat that had heretofore been unacknowledged, undiscovered. I mean, we had various iterations of it, I think, during the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, in the codification of law and various systems that the Romans were able to work out. We saw the primitive beginnings of this, I think, in ancient Greece, and iterations of it in Rome. But it wasn't, I think, and then of course during the Enlightenment and the French Republic. But I don't think it was until the American Revolution that we saw the full application of the direct corridor between man's rational nature and a political milieu, a one-to-one, that man's nature is consonant with freedom established in the United States Republic, forged by the founding fathers. And that was what I call their epistemological genius in getting it right. They just got it right.
Jason Hill, that is the most beautiful way of describing what happened that I've ever heard. And your book just eloquently outlines all that and makes a great argument. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your work, and thanks for coming on the show to talk about it. What else are you working on? What's coming up next on your plate?
I have I've got a book on literature and suicide and the meaning of life of all things. Sylvia Plath and Sexton, the moral meaning of suicide. That's
oh my god,
that's almost 70% done.
You like the deepest issues of all, don't you?
I do. So that's almost
God.
done. I'm on sabbatical to finish that book up, and then I've got another. I'm on the contract to write 2 other books. One is oh God, should I say this? One is called Man Haters: Toxic Femininity and the Assault of American Men. And then I have another one that I'm writing, let's just call it Toxic Femininity and the Assault of American Men. And I have another one that I've been researching for the past 10 years, and I'm presenting that all over the country. I just did a presentation yesterday called Leading in Chaos, Creating America's New Manifest Destiny. Because I think we need a new manifest destiny in the civilizational sense of the term.
Are you
not
just trying
colonizing.
to get canceled? Are you trying to bring cancel culture down on your head?
It's been brought on my head so many times that I think that the only way I can fight it is just by... I'm so used to it now, yeah.
Going forward. All right, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I really love the book. And this was a great conversation, really thoughtful.
Thank you so much.